I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
It was a Tuesday morning, the kind that feels like a blank ledger waiting for a series of annoying entries. I was at my desk catching up on the bank balance and wondering if Fritz was going to use chives or shallots in the lunchtime omelette when the doorbell rang. I glanced at the monitor. Standing on the stoop of the old brownstone on West 35th Street was a woman who looked like she'd been carved out of a very expensive, very cold piece of ivory. She was young, maybe mid-20s, but she carried herself with the weary grace of someone who had already seen the bottom of several deep wells. She was wrapped in a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than my first car, and her expression was less of a plea and more of a challenge. I opened the door and gave her the grin that usually works on anyone from debutantes to female grifters. Good morning. If you're looking for a detective who is eager to run around in the rain, you've got the wrong house. If you're looking for Nero Wolfe, he's currently upstairs telling 10,000 orchids how to behave, and he won't be down until 11. She didn't blink. I am Madeline Vane. My father was Arthur Vane. I believe Mr. Wolfe knew him, or at least he knew why my father died. The name hit like a soft mallet. Arthur Vane had been a titan of the shipping industry who had supposedly walked off the deck of his own yacht 20 years ago. The body was never found, but the estate had been settled, and the world had moved on. Except apparently for the ivory carving on our doorstep. The plant rooms are off limits, I said, stepping back to let her in. But the office is comfortable, and I am a very good listener. I am Archie Goodwin. She walked past me, her heels clicking on the parquet with a precision that told me she wasn't here to cry on anyone's shoulder. I led her into the office, the room that has seen more secrets than a confessional and more beer than a Bavarian tavern. She sat in the red leather chair, the one that has held everyone from governors to gunmen, and looked at Wolfe's empty desk as if it were an altar. Mr. Wolfe doesn't like surprises, I said, taking my place at my desk, and he particularly doesn't like cases that have been cold since I was in middle school. Why now? Because of this, she said. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, tarnished silver key. It was attached to a piece of parchment that looked like it had been scorched by fire. I found it in my mother's jewelry box after her funeral last week. The note says, "For the man who can see the mountain through the fog." My father always referred to Nero Wolfe as the mountain. He said the rest of the world was just the weather. I looked at the key. It wasn't a standard house key. It looked like it belonged to a safe deposit box or a very old locker. Before I could ask the next question, the elevator groaned. That's the signal that the mountain is descending. The door opened and Nero Wolfe exited. He's a seventh of a ton of genius and stubbornness, usually dressed in a yellow silk vest that makes him look like a stationary sun. He didn't look at the visitor. He walked straight to his desk, sat in the chair that was specially reinforced to handle his bulk, and adjusted his blotter. "Archie," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "You are aware that I was in the middle of a delicate repotting of the dendrobiums." "I am," I said. "But Madeline Vane here brought a souvenir from 20 years ago, father's regards, and a silver key." Wolfe's eyes, which usually stay half-closed to conserve energy, opened just a fraction wider as they landed on the key. He didn't look at Madeline, he looked at the object. To Wolfe, people are often just the messy delivery systems for interesting problems. Arthur Vane was a man of excessive ambition and inadequate caution, Wolfe remarked, his voice dropping into a register that meant he was interested, even if he'd rather be eating. He believed that a silver key could lock away the inevitable. It seems he was mistaken. "Miss Vane, why have you brought this to me instead of your family's lawyers?" "Because my father's lawyers are currently trying to prove that I am unfit to manage my inheritance," she said, her voice steady but thin. "And because since I found that key, someone has been inside my house twice. They didn't take the jewelry. They were looking for this." Wolfe leaned back, his fingers interlaced over his middle. The tap-tap-tap of his fingers began a rhythmic signal that the gears were turning. The sanctity of his brownstone was about to be disturbed by a ghost from the shipping lanes, and for reasons he wouldn't share with me yet, he was going to take the case. "Archie," Wolfe said, looking at the clock, "get the guest room ready. Miss Vane will stay here. I will not have my client hunted on the streets of Manhattan like a common pigeon and call Saul Panzer. I want to know who was on the Vane yacht the night Arthur decided to go for a swim." The heiress with the deadly secret had officially crossed the threshold. The brownstone was no longer just a house. It was a fortress for a girl with a key and a detective with a memory that never lets go. The transition from the stoop to the south room was handled with the kind of stiff-necked ceremony usually reserved for state funerals. Fritz had the luggage situation under control, which was impressive considering Madeleine Vane had arrived with nothing but a handbag and a lethal secret. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the brownstone no longer felt like a private residence. It felt like a fortified camp. Wolfe was back in his chair after lunch, his eyes half closed as he digested a plate of Fritz duck à l'orange and the implications of a silver key that had been buried for 2 decades. The invasion of the brownstone didn't happen with a battering ram. It happened with the arrival of the vultures who had been circling the Vane fortune since the day Arthur went overboard. The doorbell rang at precisely 3:14 p.m. I checked the one-way glass and saw a trio that looked like they had been sent by Central Casting for a drama titled Greed in Charcoal Grey. There was a man in his 60s with a face like a dried apple, a younger fellow who looked like he'd been polished with a chamois cloth, and a woman whose jewelry was loud enough to be heard through the oak door. I turned to Wolfe, who didn't even open his eyes. The relatives, I presume, Wolfe's side, or the legal equivalent. Let them in, Archie, but if any of them attempt to touch the globe or sit in my chair, remove them. I opened the door and ushered them in. The air in the hallway was suddenly thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the cold, sharp edge of entitlement. I led them into the office where Madeleine Vane was already seated, her ivory face showing no emotion as her family entered the room. The apple-faced man was Silas Vane, Arthur's younger brother and the current acting head of Vane Shipping. The polished young man was his son, Gregory, and the woman was Silas' wife, Evelyn. They didn't come in to sit, they came in to occupy. "This is an outrage," Silas began, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like sandpaper on silk. He didn't look at Wolfe, he looked at Madeleine. "Madeleine, you have no right to involve a private detective in family matters. You are clearly under a lot of stress. We've come to take you home." Wolfe opened his eyes then, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He didn't move a muscle, but his presence filled the space between the bookshelves. "Mr. Vane, I believe. Your niece is a guest in my house. In this room, the only rights that matter are the ones I recognize. She has asked for my assistance, and until she tells me otherwise, she remains under my protection. You, on the other hand, are currently trespassing on my patience." Evelyn Vane stepped forward, her emerald necklace clashing with the tension in the room. "Mr. Wolfe, you don't understand the stakes. There are board meetings, legalities, and the reputation of a 100-year-old firm to consider. Madeleine has been unstable since her mother's passing. We simply want what's best for her, or what's best for the safe deposit box the silver key belongs to," I asked, leaning against my desk. I watched Gregory's eyes. They flickered toward the small desk drawer where ID tucked the key, then back to Wolfe. He was the one to watch, the kind of kid who would steal your watch while you were telling him the time. "We know about the key," Gregory said, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "It's a family heirloom. It should have been returned to the firm's vault years ago. It contains nothing but old ledger records that are of no value to anyone but the auditors." "Then why did someone break into my house twice to find it?" Madeleine asked, her voice steady for the first time. "If it's just ledgers, why am I being followed? Why are you here now, Uncle Silas, instead of at the office?" The invasion was in full swing. Silas turned his gaze to Wolfe, his eyes narrowed to slits. "I am prepared to offer you a significant sum to step away from this, Wolfe. Double whatever Madeleine promised you. We just want this kept quiet. The Vane name has suffered enough." Wolfe's lip curled in a way that usually means someone is about to get hurt. "You offer me money to abandon a client. You are not only a bore, Mr. Vane, you are an amateur. My fees are not a matter for negotiation with third parties. And as for your shipping ledgers, I find it fascinating that a titan of industry would spend his afternoon chasing a few scraps of paper. It suggests the paper is not nearly as dry as you claim." The standoff lasted another 10 minutes, a psychological tug-of-war that left the air in the office feeling oily. Eventually, Silas realized that the mountain wasn't going to move, and Gregory realized I was watching his hands too closely. They retreated, their exit marked by a series of legal threats that Wolfe ignored with practiced ease. When the front door finally clicked shut, the brownstone felt quiet again, but the sanctity had been breached. The vultures knew where the meat was. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice dropping back into its usual low rumble. "They are terrified, not of the key, but of what it represents. Silas Vane did not come here to save his niece. He came here to see if I had already opened the door. The invasion has failed, but the pressure will increase. Check the locks on the south room and tell Fritz we shall have the lamb for dinner. We need the protein for the work ahead." I went to the window and watched their black sedan pull away from the curb. They weren't going far. I could see another car, a nondescript Ford, idling half a block down. Suspicious surveillance was the new wallpaper of West 35th Street. The invasion was over, but the siege had just begun. I looked at the silver key sitting on Wolfe's desk. It looked small and innocent, but it was currently the heaviest object in the house. The office felt smaller as the evening shadows stretched across the floor, thick with the lingering scent of Silas Vane's expensive tobacco and the sharper, more acidic tang of family resentment. Wolfe was back in his chair, his eyes closed, though I knew he wasn't sleeping. He was sorting through the personalities we had just encountered, filing them away like specimens in a botanical ledger. Madeline sat by the window watching the street lamps flicker to life. The circle of suspects was no longer a theoretical list on my notepad. It was a living, breathing collection of people who had been feeding on a 20-year-old mystery, and every one of them had a reason to want that silver key at the bottom of the Hudson. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "The suspects. Give me the summary." I leaned back at my desk, ticking them off on my fingers. "First, we have Silas Vane, the apple-faced uncle. He's been running the shipping firm since Arthur vanished, but he's always been the younger brother in the shadow of a titan. If Arthur's disappearance wasn't quite the accident the papers said it was, Silas is the primary beneficiary of the silence. He's got the motive of a man who finally got the top job and doesn't want to be demoted by a ghost." "And the wife?" Wolfe prompted, his eyes still closed. "Evelyn Vane," I said. "She wears her jewels like armor. She was the one who pushed for the probate to be settled early back in the day. Rumor is she was the one who convinced Arthur's wife to stay quiet about the inconsistencies in the yacht's log. She's not protecting the firm, she's protecting the lifestyle. She looks like the type who would bury a body just to make sure the guest list for her next gala stayed intact." I shifted to the third name. "Then there's Gregory, the chamois-polished son. He's the new breed MBA, sharp suits, and a soul like a spreadsheet. He's been trying to modernize Vane shipping, which mostly means selling off the old assets and turning the company into a holding firm. But he needs total control to do that. If there's a secret in that key that could invalidate the inheritance or shift the voting shares, he's the one with the most to lose in the future." "And the fourth?" Wolfe asked. "The ghost in the machine," I replied. "Julian Thorne, Arthur's former first mate and the only witness who was on the yacht that night. He disappeared shortly after the inquiry, but Saul Panzer found a lead. Thorne's been living in a cabin in Maine on a pension that looks a lot like hush money. He's back in town, Wolfe. I saw a man matching his description sitting in the back of the black sedan with Silas. If Silas is the bank, Thorne is the vault." Wolfe's fingers began their rhythmic tap-tap-tap against the arms of his chair. A circle of four. The usurper, the socialite, the modernizer, and the witness. Each is bound by a common thread of bitterness and a common fear of the truth. Arthur Vane was not a man who inspired loyalty. Archie, he inspired debt. And a debt that is 20 years old carries a very high interest rate. Madeline turned from the window, her face pale in the twilight. They all hated him, even my mother. She loved the life he gave her, but she feared him. That's why she kept the key hidden. She wasn't waiting for the right time to tell the truth. She was waiting for a time when she was safe from him. And even after he was gone, she felt his shadow. She told me once that Arthur never truly left the yacht. He just changed his form. A poetic sentiment, Wolfe remarked, but physically impossible. Men do not change their form, they merely change their location. The question is not where Arthur went, but what he left behind that required a silver key to protect. Silas claims it is ledgers. Gregory claims it is heirlooms. I suspect it is a narrative one Thorne was paid to forget, and the one Silas was paid to inherit. I watched the suspects through the lens of my own observations. Silas was too nervous, Gregory was too eager, and Evelyn was too scripted. They weren't just beneficiaries of an estate, they were beneficiaries of a crime that had been frozen in time. The tension between them was palpable. They didn't trust each other any more than they trusted us. They were a pack of wolves who had shared a kill 20 years ago, and were now realizing that one of them might be ready to turn on the others to save their own skin. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice sharpening, "tomorrow morning you will find Julian Thorne. If he is the witness, he is the weakest link in their circle. A man who lives on hush money for 20 years is a man who is always looking over his shoulder. I want him in this office. And tell Saul to keep an eye on Gregory. The young man has a look of desperate ambition that often leads to clumsy mistakes." I headed for the kitchen to check on dinner, the names of the suspects swirling in my head. The beneficiaries of bitterness were starting to fray at the edges, and Nero Wolfe was just beginning to pull at the loose threads. The brownstone was quiet, but I knew that outside, in the cold Manhattan night, the circle was tightening. We had the key, but they had the secrets, and the next 24 hours were going to determine which was more lethal. Wednesday morning arrived with a sky the color of a wet sidewalk, a perfect backdrop for the kind of legwork that involves more waiting than walking. Wolfe was upstairs with his orchids, presumably discussing the finer points of humidity with Eulalia, while I was out in the Heron, tracking the movements of the Vane family's pet witness. Saul Panzer had done his usual magic, pinpointing Julian Thorne to a transient hotel on 47th Street kind of place, where the lobby smells of pine cleaner and desperation, and nobody asks why you're paying in cash. I spent 3 hours shadowed in a doorway across the street, watching the rhythm of the block. Thorne eventually emerged around noon. He was a man who looked like he had been hollowed out by the salt air and 20 years of looking over his shoulder. He wore a heavy pea coat that was a size too big and a fisherman's cap pulled low, but he couldn't hide the way his eyes darted toward every passing taxi. He didn't look like a man enjoying a comfortable pension. He looked like a man waiting for a sentence to be carried out. I followed him a discreet distance as he wound his way through the midtown crowds. He wasn't just wondering he was meeting someone. He stopped at a small, dingy cafeteria and took a corner booth that offered a clear view of the entrance. 5 minutes later, Gregory Vane entered. The chamois-polished sun looked remarkably out of place in a room that specialized in lukewarm coffee and day-old crumpets. He sat opposite Thorne, and though I couldn't hear the words, the body language told the story. Gregory was leaning in, his hands moving in sharp, urgent gestures. Thorne was shaking his head, his face a mask of stubborn fear. I moved closer, snagging a tray and a cup of something that tasted like roasted acorns, and took a seat behind a plastic partition 2 booths away. Gregory's voice was a low, insistent hiss that occasionally broke through the clatter of silverware. "You're not thinking clearly, Julian," Gregory said. "My father is old-fashioned. He thinks he can still buy silence with a monthly envelope. But the girl has Wolfe now. If that key opens the box in the Jersey warehouse, the envelope stops being a pension and starts being evidence. You need to get out of town. I have a plane waiting at Teterboro. I've been running for 20 years, kid," Thorne rasped. His voice sounded like gravel being turned over. "Your father told me that after Arthur went over, the world would forget. But the world doesn't forget. It just waits. The girl has his eyes, Gregory. When she looked at me in the car yesterday, I saw Arthur. I'm not going to Maine. I'm going to be the only person who can end it." Gregory's hand shot across the table, gripping Thorne's wrist. "You're going nowhere near 35th Street. You think Wolfe cares about you. He'll squeeze you dry and hand you to the DA to save his client's inheritance. My offer is the only one that keeps you out of a cell." The shadows of the sidewalks were getting longer, and so was Gregory's temper. He eventually stood up, leaving a bill on the table that was far too large for the check, and stormed out. Thorne sat there for a long time, staring into his cold coffee. I waited until he stood up to leave before I made my move. I caught him at the revolving door, my hand firm but not aggressive on his elbow. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice casual but carrying that specific edge that tells a man not to run. "Archie Goodwin. We met briefly in the back of a black sedan yesterday. I think you and I have some things to talk about that don't involve Teterboro or Maine." He froze, his breath hitching. "Wolfe's man. You've been following me. "It's a hobby of mine," I said, steering him toward the heron parked around the corner. "Look, Gregory wants you on a plane, and Silas wants you in a box. Neither of those options sounds particularly healthy for a man of your age. Mr. Wolfe, however, just wants the truth. He's much more interested in the how than the who, provided the who is willing to be honest for once in 2 decades. I got him into the car, and the ride back to the brownstone was silent. Thorne sat hunched against the door, watching the city go by like a man seeing it for the last time. When we reached 35th Street, I noticed the nondescript Ford was gone, replaced by a delivery van that had been parked in the same spot for 2 hours. The surveillance was getting more professional, which meant the stakes were getting higher. I led Thorne into the office just as Wolfe was descending. The mountain met the witness, and for a moment, the room seemed to vibrate with the sheer weight of the history between them. Wolfe sat at his desk, his eyes travelling over Thorne with a look that was more clinical than judgmental. "Mr. Thorne," Wolfe said, his voice a low, melodic rumble, "you have spent 20 years as a footnote in a tragedy. I believe it is time you became the lead character. Archie, get Mr. Thorne a drink, not coffee with bourbon. He has the look of a man who has been thirsty for a long time." I poured the drink, watching the way Thorne's hand shook as he took the glass. The sidewalks had yielded their shadow, and the legwork had brought the weakest link into the center of the brownstone. But as I looked at the delivery van through the window, I realized that the shadows hadn't stayed outside. They were creeping closer to the front door, and they weren't interested in conversation. The atmosphere in the brownstone had taken on a peculiar, brittle quality by Thursday morning. Julian Thorne was tucked away in the front room with a bottle of bourbon and his own ghosts, while Madeline Vane remained in the south room, presumably contemplating the weight of her silver key. Wolfe was back from his morning session with the orchids, seated at his desk and examining a map of the New Jersey waterfront with the kind of intensity most men reserve for their bank statements. But the first sign that the enemy had truly breached our perimeter didn't come from a gunshot or a legal summons. It came from the dining room. I was in the office, checking the morning mail, when Fritz entered. He wasn't carrying a tray, and his face was a mask of controlled professional distress. In his hand was a small, empty silver tray that usually held our condiment set. "Archie," Fritz said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "The mustard pot, the small one with the lion's head. It is gone." I looked up from the mail, my jaw tightening. In the brownstone, a missing mustard pot isn't just a kitchen mishap, it's a violation of the natural order. Fritz polishes that silver with the devotion of a monk. He knows the location of every spoon and shaker like a general knows his battalions. "When did you see it last, Fritz?" I asked, standing up. "It was there at breakfast, Archie." I cleared the table after Miss Vane and Mr. Thorne finished. I went to the kitchen to prepare the mid-morning snack for Mr. Wolfe. When I returned to reset for lunch, the pot was missing, and the window in the dining room, it was unlatched. Only by a fraction, but it was unlatched. I didn't wait for Wolfe to give the order. I went into the dining room and checked the window. Fritz was right. The catch was loose, and there was a faint, almost invisible smudge of oil on the sill. Someone had been inside. They hadn't come for the girl, and they hadn't come for the key. They had come to prove that the brownstone was no longer a fortress. The subtle trespass was a message, written in the absence of a silver coin. I went back into the office and gave Wolfe the news. He didn't move a muscle, but his eyes narrowed until they were just 2 sharp glints in the folds of his face. He hated being touched, he hated being moved, and he hated, above all else, the idea that his sanctuary could be breached by a common prowler. "The mustard pot, Archie?" Wolfe asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "The lion's head one," I confirmed. "Fritz is devastated, and the dining room window was the entry point." "Thayer getting cocky, Wolfe. They wanted us to know they could get in while we were sitting right here talking about the case." "It was not a theft," Archie, Wolfe said, his fingers beginning their rhythmic tap-tap-tap against the arms of his chair. "It was a displacement. Look at the bookshelves. The 4th shelf from the bottom, the 3rd volume of the History of Maritime Law." I walked over to the shelf. The book was there, but as I pulled it out, a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. It wasn't a note, it was a photograph. It showed Madeline Vane sitting at the south bedroom window, taken from the street. On the back, written in a cramped, precise hand, were the words, A mountain is only as strong as its foundation. The silver is not yours to keep. They were in here, I said, the anger starting to boil in my chest. While we were in the kitchen or the basement, they slipped in, planted the photo, and took the mustard pot as a souvenir. It's Gregory, or someone Gregory hired. He's the only one with enough nerves and enough money to play this kind of game. Wolfe leaned back, his eyes closing. The trespass had changed the tempo of the mystery. It was no longer a matter of protecting a client's inheritance, it was a matter of defending the sanctity of West 35th Street. Wolfe takes a breach of his home personally, and a person who makes it personal with Nero Wolfe is usually making their final mistake. They believe that by disturbing my routine, they can force a negotiation, Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute cold focus. They assume that I will be rattled by a missing piece of silver and a photograph. They are mistaken. Trespass tells me two things, Archie. First, that the silver key opens something they cannot afford to have found. Second, that they are desperate enough to risk a direct confrontation in this house. He opened his eyes and looked at the clock. The mustard pot will be returned, Archie, along with interest in offending. Call Saul Panzer. Tell him to move from the hotel to the Jersey warehouse district. I want every safe deposit facility and private locker within 5 miles of the Vane shipping docks under surveillance. And Archie tells Fritz to serve lunch. We will not allow a petty thief to dictate our appetite. I headed for the kitchen, my mind racing. The missing mustard pot was a taunt, a subtle trespass designed to shake the mountain. But as I watched Wolfe go back to his maritime map, I realized that Gregory Vane had just handed us the missing piece of the puzzle. They weren't just afraid of the key, they were afraid of the location. And now, thanks to their own arrogance, we knew exactly where the mountain needed to fall. The theft of the silver mustard pot had acted as a catalyst, transforming Wolfe's intellectual curiosity into a cold, focused enmity. He sat behind his desk with the immobility of a Buddha made of granite, his eyes fixed on the photograph I had found in the maritime law volume. The intrusion into the brownstone was a strategic blunder on Gregory Vane's part. He had mistaken Wolfe's physical inactivity for a lack of reach. But as the afternoon faded into a murky, rain-streaked evening, the pressure didn't just stay within our walls. It began to manifest as a second shadow, one that followed every move we made and signaled that the opposition was ready to discard their velvet gloves. "Saul has called in," I reported, leaning against the edge of the desk. I had spent the last hour checking the perimeter of the house, finding nothing but the lingering scent of damp wool near the service entrance. He's at a diner in Secaucus, keeping an eye on a facility called the Iron Vault. It's a private storage warehouse about 3 blocks from the Vane shipping piers. About an hour ago, a car matching Gregory's black sedan pulled up. He didn't go in, but he met a man in the parking loader fellow who looks like he's spent most of his life breaking things for a living. Thayer nervous, Wolfe. Thayer circling the drain. Wolfe's fingers began their rhythmic, silent dance against his belly. The second shadow, Archie. It is not just the surveillance outside our door. It is the realization that Silas and Gregory are no longer acting in concert. The boy is moving independently of the father. Silas wants to buy the secret, Gregory wants to incinerate it. The meeting Saul witnessed suggests that the modernizer is prepared to use more than spreadsheets to protect the Vane legacy. The phone rang, its sharp trill cutting through the heavy atmosphere of the office. I picked it up, expecting Saul, but the voice on the other end was a dry, frantic whisper. It was Silas Vane. "Goodwin, is he there? Is Wolfe there?" The man sounded like he was running out of air. "Listen to me. Tell Madeline to stay home. Tell her not to trust whatever Gregory tells her. He's found the second key, the one Arthur gave to the firm's auditor. He's at the Iron Vault tonight. He thinks he can erase the journals before the board meeting tomorrow. But he doesn't know what's really there. He doesn't know the cargo." "What cargo, Silas?" I asked, but the line died with a sharp, mechanical click. I looked at Wolfe and repeated the message. The mountain finally moved, leaning forward until the light from the desk lamp caught the sharp, predatory glint in his eyes. The second betrayal was here. Gregory was double-crossing his own father to secure his position. The second shadow was the threat of a final, permanent erasure of the truth. "The cargo," Wolfe murmured, the word tasting like lead in the air. "Arthur Vane did not just vanish, Archie. He committed a crime so profound that he had to become a ghost to escape it. And Silas has been the silent partner in that ghosthood for 20 years. Archie, the car. We are going to New Jersey. I asked, my eyebrows hitting the ceiling. Wolfe doesn't leave the brownstone for anything less than a national emergency or a very specific type of rare orchid. I will not have the resolution of this case handled by a third party in a warehouse, Wolfe snapped, standing up with a sudden, surprising grace that made the floorboards groan in protest. Madeline will stay here with Fritz and Julian Thorne. The house is bolted. Take the heron. And tell Saul to be ready. If Gregory Vane believes he can use iron to protect his lies, he is about to find that my logic is the stronger metal. As we walked to the hallway, I checked my .38 in its shoulder holster. The second shadow was lengthening, and the drive across the bridge felt like crossing a border into a war zone. The rain turned into a blinding downpour, blurring city lights into smears of neon and grey. Wolfe sat in the back of the heron, a massive, silent presence that seemed to fill the entire car. He didn't look at the scenery, he looked at the silver key I had returned to him. The pressure is at the bursting point, Archie, Wolfe said as we approached the Jersey side. When the second shadow moves, the first one must be revealed. Gregory believes he is the predator, but he has forgotten that in the dark, everyone is a target. We are not going there to stop a theft. We are going there to witness an unveiling. We pulled into the shadow of the massive, rusted warehouses of the Secaucus waterfront. Saul was waiting in a darkened sedan across from the iron vault, his lights flickering once to acknowledge our arrival. The black sedan was there too, parked crookedly near the loading dock. The door to the facility was slightly ajar, a sliver of yellow light cutting through the rain. The second shadow had led us to the heart of the fog, and for the first time in 20 years, the silver key was about to meet its lock. The interior of the iron vault smelled of cold concrete, motor oil, and the slow, agonizing decay of paper. It was a cavernous space, filled with rows of steel lockers that stretched into the gloom like the ribs of a prehistoric beast. Wolfe did not scurry or crouch. He walked down the center aisle with the measured tread of a man who owned the air he breathed. Saul Panzer trailed us like a shadow given substance, his hand resting casually near his waistband, his eyes never staying on one spot for more than a second. We found the light coming from locker 412, near the very back of the facility, where the sound of the rain on the corrugated metal roof was a dull, rhythmic thud. Gregory Vane was there, his chamois-polished exterior finally cracked. His hair was damp, his expensive tie was loosened, and he was staring into the depths of a double-wide storage unit. Beside him stood a man who looked like a professional Hadashia thick-necked fellow, in a canvas jacket holding a crowbar. They weren't looking at us yet. They were looking at the contents of the locker. It wasn't just ledgers. It was a collection of heavy wooden crates marked with the Vane shipping seal, dated 1906. "I wouldn't touch the pry bar, Mr. Vane," Wolfe's voice boomed through the warehouse, the resonance of it making Gregory jump as if he'd been struck by a live wire. "The cargo inside those crates is far more volatile than the reputations you are trying to preserve. If you open them now, you are not merely a thief, you are a witness to a crime that has no statute of limitations." Gregory spun around, his face a pale mask of fury and fear. "Wolfe, how did you—" He stopped, his eyes darting to Saul and then to me. "This is private property. You have no right to be here. My father is an old man who sees ghosts in every hallway, but I am a man of the present." Clearing out the junk. "The junk, as you call it, is the weight that sank your father's yacht," Wolfe said, coming to a halt 10 feet away. He didn't look at Gregory, he looked at the crates. "Archie, the key." I stepped forward and handed Wolfe the silver key we had been carrying since Tuesday. He held it up, the small piece of metal glinting in the harsh overhead light. "This key does not open the locker, Mr. Vane. The locker was merely the shell. This key opens the manifest tucked into the false bottom of that desk inside the unit. The manifest that details exactly what Arthur Vane was carrying the night he vanished. It wasn't silk or spices. It was gold bullion intended for a revolutionary government in South America gold that was officially lost at sea when the ship supposedly went down. Gregory's breath hitched. "You're dreaming. My father told me it was all insurance fraud, a simple sink and collect. Your father lied to you to keep you from becoming an accomplice to treason," Wolfe remarked, his voice dropping into a register of cold, clinical precision. Arthur Vane didn't walk off that yacht. He staged his death to escape the consequences of the theft, and he spent the next 20 years living in that cabin in Maine, the one you think belongs to Julian Thorne. Silas has been paying the pension not to a witness but to a brother. The man I brought into my house yesterday is not my first mate. He is Arthur Vane. The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the dripping of the rain from Gregory's coat. It was the ultimate string pull. Wolfe had been positioning the suspects since the moment Madeline crossed our threshold, playing on their individual greeds and fears until they led us directly to the evidence of the original sin. The second shadow had been the ghost of Arthur Vane himself, hiding in plain sight while his family fought over the scraps of his legend. Silas wanted the secret kept because it protected the firm's liquidity. Wolfe continued, pulling the strings tighter. Evelyn wanted it kept because it protected her social standing. But you, Gregory, you wanted it because you realized that if Arthur was still alive, your entire inheritance was a fiction. You didn't come here to find the gold. You came here to find the proof that your uncle was a living man, so you could ensure he became a dead one before the board meeting. The thick-necked man with the crowbar took a step toward us, but Saul's hand moved an inch, and the man froze. Gregory looked at the crates, then at Wolfe, his eyes burning with a desperate trapped light. "He's a ghost, Wolfe. He's been dead for 20 years to everyone who matters," Gregory shouted, his voice echoing off the steel walls. "If I destroy the manifest, he stays a ghost. My father gets his piece and I get company. It's a clean edit." "There is no such thing as a clean edit in a narrative of blood," Wolfe said, his voice as immovable as the concrete floor. "Archie, call Inspector Cramer. Tell him to meet us at the brownstone, and tell him to bring a large car. We have a titan of industry to unmask, and a nephew who has mistaken a warehouse for a sanctuary. The strings have been pulled, Mr. Vane. The curtain is about to rise on the final act." We left Gregory standing in the yellow light of the locker, a small man surrounded by the heavy weight of a stolen past. As we walked back to the Heron, the rain felt cleaner, as if the fog was finally starting to lift. Wolfe sat in the back, his eyes closed, already composing the final interrogation. The strings had been pulled, the positioning was complete, and the silver key was finally going home. The office was no longer a room for consultation, it had become a stage for a reckoning, illuminated by the cold, unwavering glow of the desk lamps. It was nearly midnight, and the air in the brownstone was thick enough to chew. Outside, the rain had turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the window panes, but inside, the silence was absolute. Nero Wolfe sat in his throne behind the desk, his massive hands resting on the arms of his chair, his eyes half closed. He looked like a judge who had already written the verdict and was simply waiting for the court to assemble. The office gathering was complete. On the far left sat Silas Vane, his apple-shaped face now a pale, waxy mask of exhaustion. Beside him, Evelyn Vane gripped her handbag so tightly the leather groaned, her emeralds flashing with every shallow breath. Gregory Vane, brought back from the Jersey warehouse by a very grim Saul Panzer, sat in the red leather chair, his chamois-polished exterior completely shattered. In the corner, Madeline Vane stood by the globe, her eyes fixed on the man who had been hiding in the front room, the man I had brought back from the sidewalks of Midtown. Julian Thornier, rather, Arthur Vane stood by the bookshelf. He had removed his fisherman's cap, revealing a shock of white hair and a face that was a roadmap of 20 years of exile and regret. He didn't look like a titan of industry, he looked like a man who had been shipwrecked in his own life. "We are here," Wolfe began, his voice a low, melodic rumble that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards, "to discuss the mechanics of a ghost. For 20 years, this family has existed as a lie, a carefully constructed narrative of tragedy and inheritance. You, Silas, were the author. You, Evelyn, was the editor. And you, Gregory, were the ambitious reader who decided the ending needed to be more violent." Silas let out a sound that was half sob and half wheeze. "I did it for the firm, Wolfe. Arthur had stolen that gold. Had he been caught, Vane's name would have been dragged through the mud. The insurance claims, the lawsuits, it would have been the end. When he suggested the disappearance, I saw it as the only way to save the legacy. I paid him to stay dead. You paid him to stay dead because his death made you the master," Wolfe remarked, his eyes opening to sharp golden slits. But a ghost is an expensive tenant. As the years passed, the pension became a burden. And then Madeline found the silver Kythe one Arthur had kept as his only leverage, his final insurance policy against your potential change of heart. He sent it to her mother, hoping that one day the truth would force a resolution. He did not expect his own daughter to bring it to me. Wolfe turned his gaze to Gregory. The young man, however, had a different perspective. Gregory did not want to manage a ghost, he wanted to manage a corporation. He realized that if Arthur Vane were ever revealed as a living man, the entire structure of the inheritance would collapse. The voting shares, the dividends, the very legality of the firm's leadership all would be void. To Gregory, Arthur was not an uncle, he was a defect in the ledger. Gregory didn't look away. He's a criminal, Wolfe. He stole millions in gold and let the world think he was a hero who went down with his ship. Why should I lose my future because of a 20-year-old theft? I went to the warehouse to find the manifest, to burn the only proof that the gold ever existed. If the gold is gone, the motive for the disappearance stays buried. And the mustard pot, Gregory? I asked, leaning against my desk, the little lion's head. Was that part of the clean edit? Gregory's lip curled. A distraction. I wanted you to think I was a petty thief. I wanted you to look at the dining room while I was moving to the warehouse. I didn't think Wolfe would actually leave the house. Nobody told me the mountain could walk. The mountain does not need to walk to see the horizon, Mr. Vane, Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a register of cold, clinical precision. You breached my home to taunt me, a mistake born of the arrogance of your generation. You believe that because you understand spreadsheets, you understand the human soul. You do not. You were prepared to kill your own uncle tonight in that warehouse to ensure the manifest was never read. You brought a man with a crowbar, not to open crates, but to close a chapter. Arthur Vane stepped forward, his voice a dry rasp. He's right, Silas. I saw him in the parking lot. I saw the look in his eyes. He isn't like us. We were thieves, but we weren't killers. Gregory is a different breed entirely. The tension in the room was at the bursting point. Madeline walked over to her father, her hand hovering near his arm but not quite touching it. The heiress and the ghost, finally standing in the same light. The office gathering had stripped away the charcoal grey suits and the emeralds, leaving only the raw, ugly bones of a family built on a foundation of stolen gold and paid silence. The board meeting is tomorrow morning, Wolfe said, looking at the clock. The manifest I retrieved from the warehouse is currently in the hands of the federal authorities. The gold bullion, or what remains of it in those crates, will be returned to the treasury of the nation it was stolen from. The Vane shipping firm will be liquidated to pay fines and interest for 20 years of fraud. The legacy is over. Evelyn Vane let out a sharp, jagged cry. You've ruined us. Everything we built, everything we worked for, you built nothing, Wolfe snapped, his voice like a falling axe. You merely committed a crime. The gathering is over. Archie called Inspector Cramer. Tell him the Titan is ready for his final voyage, and the nephew is ready for a cell. The silver key has done its work. It has opened the one thing you all feared most, the truth. I headed for the phone, the names and the motives finally aligning in a single devastating narrative. The office was quiet now, the storm outside finally breaking, as the Vane family sat in the ruins of their own making. Nero Wolfe sat in his chair, the conductor of a justice that had taken 20 years to reach its final chord. The office was suddenly far too large for the people remaining in it, yet the air felt as though it had been replaced by the heavy, ancient dust of a tomb that had finally been breached. Inspector Cramer had departed with his prize, a caravan of police cars carrying away the remains of the Vane dynasty. The silence that followed was thick and absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, muffled ticking of the clock on the mantel. Nero Wolfe sat behind his desk, his eyes closed, his massive hands resting on the arms of his chair like a king who had just signed a treaty for a war he never wanted to fight. The ledger of lies was no longer a mystery. It was a physical weight sitting on the desk between us. The manifest I had retrieved from the iron vault, those pages that had caused a disappearance, a corporate coup, and a breach of our own front door, looked remarkably ordinary under the yellow glow of the desk lamp. It was just a stack of paper, bound by a fading ribbon, and stamped with the ink of a forgotten era, yet it had been the fulcrum upon which several lives had just been shattered. Wolfe opened his eyes and looked at the silver key. "The irony of the material world, Archie," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. Arthur Vane spent 20 years in a forced silence, a living ghost maintained by Silas Vane's checkbook. He kept that key not to achieve a late-life return to power, but to ensure that his erasure was not permanent. He knew that Silas would eventually succumb to the gravity of his own greed or his son's ambition. He didn't write a confession, he created a mechanical certainty that the truth would one day be unavoidable. I sat at my desk, pulling a fresh sheet of paper into the typewriter to start the formal report. My fingers felt stiff from the cold rain of New Jersey. It's a hell of a price for a secret, Wolfe. Silas is looking at a dozen counts of fraud and obstruction. Gregory is being fitted for a suit at Sing Sing for attempted murder and theft, and the Vane shipping empire is going to be picked apart by federal auditors like a carcass on a beach, all because of a few crates of gold that should have been delivered in 1906. It was never just the gold, Archie, Wolfe remarked, reaching for the crystal bottle of beer that Fritz had placed on the desk 5 minutes ago. The foam rose in a perfect, creamy head. It was the precedent. Arthur Vane believed his intellect was superior to the law, and Silas believed his loyalty to the firm was superior to the truth. They were a parasitic binary. When Arthur died, the parasite became the predator. Silas used the crime to lock Arthur away, not to protect his brother, but to protect the brand. The Vane fortune was built on the bones of a man who was already dead to the world, and Gregory was simply the next evolution of that Rota man who wanted to kill the ghost to keep the castle. I stopped typing and looked at the manifest, and the girl, Madeline, she's the only one who came out of this with anything resembling a soul, but she's lost her family and probably her fortune by the time the feds are done. Ms. Vane has achieved the only thing that matters, Wolfe said, his eyes narrowing. She has achieved the truth. She no longer has to wonder if her father was a hero or a coward, or if her mother's jewelry box contained a legacy or a curse. She is free of the fog. As for the fortune, it was never hers to begin with. It was the spoils of a larceny. She will find that the lack of $1 billion is a small price to pay for the ability to sleep without hearing the ocean in her dreams. The phone rang, its sharp trill cutting through the philosophical gloom. It was Saul Panzer, reporting from the waterfront. He had found the secondary ledger, the one Gregory had tried to toss into the Hudson before the handcuffs went on. It confirmed everything Wolfe had deduced: the payments to the pensioner in Maine, the diverted insurance funds, and the decades of blackmail that had kept the Vane shipping docks running on a foundation of lies. "The ledger is closed, Saul," I said into the receiver. "A stenographer at Center Street is reading it into the record. Go get some coffee and put the heater on in your car. You've earned it." I hung up and looked at Wolfe. He was staring at the empty space on the dining room sideboard where the silver mustard pot had once sat. "You knew Gregory was the one who moved that, didn't you? Even before the Jersey trip. Gregory Vane is a modern man, Archie. He could not resist the urge to leave a digital signature in a world of analog logic. He moved the mustard pot to tell me that my own environment was as susceptible to his manipulation as the Vane shipping manifest. He believed that by trespassing in our home, he had proven his superiority. He forgot that the past is not a spreadsheet, it is a foundation. One cannot edit the foundation without the entire structure collapsing upon the editor. Wolfe stood, a sudden movement signaling the end of intellectual engagement. He walked over to the globe and gave it a small, decisive spin. "The gold will be returned, Archie. The ghost will return to the sea, this time with the law as his escort. The ledger of lies has reached its final entry. The truth is no longer a cargo that can be hidden in a warehouse. It is a debt that has finally been collected with interest." I watched the globe spin, the colors of the world blurring into a single grey smear. The fog had lifted, but the room still felt haunted by the weight of 20 years of silence. Wolfe headed for the elevator, his yellow vest disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. The game was over, the silver key was back in the drawer, and the final draft was in the hands of the law. I turned back to my typewriter, the keys clicking away in the silence of the brownstone, recording the last few footnotes of a story that should have ended 2 decades ago. The following morning, the brownstone had reclaimed its usual atmosphere of heavy scholarly peace, as if the ghosts of the Vane shipping empire had been exorcised by the mere act of Fritz scrubbing the office floor and returning the Waterford decanter to its precise coordinates. The sun was hitting the back of the house, casting long golden rectangles across the parquet where, only hours ago, the beneficiaries of bitterness had stood in judgment of themselves. I had spent the early hours at the precinct, dealing with the kind of paperwork that makes you wish you'd taken up a simpler profession, like ice harvesting or professional quietude. By the time I walked back into the office at 11, the city outside was humming with its usual chaotic energy, but inside, the air was as still as a frozen pond. Wolfe was in his chair, but he wasn't reading. He was staring at the silver mustard pot, which had been recovered from Gregory Vane's car and returned to its rightful place on the dining room sideboard. It had been polished until it glowed like a miniature sun, the lion's head handle looking particularly fierce in the morning light. The silver key, the manifest, and the scorched parchment were gone, taken as evidence by two men from the district attorney's office who looked like they'd never seen a piece of maritime history that didn't have a subpoena attached. In their place was a fresh bottle of beer and a small, delicate sprig of a phalaenopsis that Theodore had brought down to signal that the world was once again focused on things that grew rather than things that were suppressed. "The DA is happy, Wolfe," I said, tossing my hat onto the rack and sliding into my chair. I felt like I'd been through a meat grinder, but the sight of Wolfe's immovable yellow vest somehow made the world feel right side up again. "Cramer says Gregory is already trying to blame the thick-necked fellow with the crowbar for the misunderstanding at the warehouse, but since Saul caught him with the ledger and a motive the size of a cruise ship, he's not going to find much traction. Silas is singing like a canary, mostly to keep himself out of a cell, and Evelyn is currently trying to convince a lawyer that her emeralds are personal property and not part of the shipping fraud. It's a regular festival of finger-pointing." Wolfe didn't look up. He poured his beer with a steady hand, the head forming a perfect creamy inch at the top of the glass. "The happiness of the district attorney is a matter of supreme indifference to me, Archie. Solution integrity is what matters. A problem was posed, its variables were analyzed, and its conclusion was reached. The fact that it also happens to involve the dismantling of a corporate parasite's empire is merely a pleasant side effect. Arthur Vane has finally ceased to be a ghost, and in doing so, he has ceased to be a commodity. Pleasant for us, maybe. Not so much for the board of directors," I noted, leaning back. "They're currently at a hotel in Midtown, wondering if they're going to be the next ones to be audited by the public. Madeline Vane told me to tell you that she's heading to a quiet place in the Berkshires to figure out what to do with the rest of her life. She's leaving the Vane name behind, and I can't say I blame her. She said to keep the key as a souvenir of a mountain that didn't move." Wolfe grunted, a sound of deep subterranean skepticism. "Ms. Vane is a woman who discovered that a legacy is often just a polite word for a debt. She has the wisdom to walk away from the wreckage, which is a rare quality in a world obsessed with salvage. As for the key, it is no longer a tool of leverage, it is a piece of tarnished silver. Archie, see that it is placed in the drawer with the other curiosities of human folly." Fritz came in then, carrying a tray with a small covered dish and a fresh pot of coffee. He looked at the mustard pot on the sideboard and gave it a small, satisfied nod, as if confirming that the natural order of the universe had been restored. "Everything is in order, Archie?" he asked, his voice a comfortingly domestic baritone. "As in order as it ever gets, Fritz," I said, reaching for the coffee. "The air is clear. The cargo has been found, and the only thing left in this house that is out of place is the memory of 1906. Fritz nodded, satisfied, and retreated to the kitchen. A few minutes later, the elevator groaned that familiar sound of the mountain returning to the plain sand. The rhythmic thud of Wolfe's footsteps signaled the end of his midday session. He had spent the last hour with the orchids, a ritual that always seems to reset his internal clock after a brush with the ugliness of family secrets. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice a low, resonant vibration that seemed to anchor the room, "tell Saul that his bonus for the work at the Iron Vault will be processed this afternoon, and remind him, if he ever again brings me a case involving a man who thinks a crowbar is a substitute for a conscience, I shall expect him to provide a more sophisticated explanation for the smell of damp wool in his reports." "I'll tell him," I said, smiling at my typewriter. "But I think he's more worried about the cold he caught while standing in that Jersey rain." He says his nose feels like it's been through a saltwater wash. Wolfe settled back into his chair, the springs groaning in protest as he adjusted his weight. He looked at the clock on the mantel, then at the empty space where the maritime map had been. The heiress with the deadly secret was a lesson in the dangers of the fixed idea. Archie. Silas Vane believed his ambition could buy silence. Gregory believed his youth could edit history. They all forgot that the truth is the only ingredient that cannot be substituted in the kitchen of justice. It has a way of surfacing, even when it has been weighted down by gold and buried in the fog for 20 years. He reached for his book, a thick volume on the history of the Silk Road, and I knew the case was officially filed away. The brownstone was a fortress once more, the mustard pot was home, and the world was just the weather outside the window. I turned back to my typewriter, the keys clicking away in the silence of West 35th Street, recording the last few footnotes of a mystery that had finally reached its final page.